Hi everyone, welcome back to another video with Duade, Paton and me, Jan Wegener. We had a little delay in filming another video because you had a couple loose screws and a loose wire that had to be refitted.
Yeah, that sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? They weren't able to fix the loose screws, but for anyone who's followed my channel, I've had a cardiac arrest a number of years ago, and I have a defibrillator that's in my chest, which keeps me alive, which is amazing. But unfortunately, a couple of the leads that go to my heart dislodged, and they were trying to protrude through the skin. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Alien, where this thing comes through the chest. I had this weird lead protruding, and the doctor was worried it would come through and cause an infection. So I had to go and be cut open.
I would be worried too, to be honest.
Yeah, it looked weird, honestly. Every time I moved my arm, this thing's moving around. It was just weird. So I had to go back to Melbourne and have surgery and be cut open, and it's all sorted now. I'm all back to normal and yeah, good to go.
Well, I'm glad you're still alive and it's keeping you alive, but that definitely doesn't sound like a nice experience. But on a happier note, we both had Sony's new 400 to 800mm lens for a little while. We were headed for almost 2 weeks, so that means a lot of trips to the field with the lens. We talked a lot while we were testing the lens because it's definitely, I don't know what I would call it, not controversial, but definitely a different kind of approach to that kind of lens.
When you first heard a 400 f8, what was your immediate thoughts?
I was definitely intrigued because it's the kind of focal range that we would love to have. And we were also thinking if it works well with a teleconverter, then you have like 400 to like almost 1200mm. That would definitely be cool for bird photography. And I must say I'm not too scared by Aperture anymore. Like we've had a lot of lenses, f11, f8, f9, f7.1. Like it all kind of mushes together. Obviously faster is better, but for me, what was mainly important is that it focuses fast, has hopefully good image stabilization, and also that we just get nice and really sharp results.
Yeah, I was the same as you. When I first heard about it, I thought I'd missed the 200 to 400 end, and I was a little bit concerned about the weight, and obviously f8's a bit slow, but we're used to that with f9. But it's one of those things, we've talked about this before, specs only tell half the story. It's not until you get the gear and try it that you actually have a proper impression. Much like your R1, that blew us away. When I got this and I went into the field and I started using it, when I looked at the photos, my opinion kind of changed because I was going, oh, well, this is a sharp lens. And this zoom throw is so beautiful to use. 800mm is fantastic. So my in-field experience sold the lens to me. I know there's a few drawbacks with price and weight, etc. But in terms of the usability and the terms of the types of photos you can get, I was very happy. You?
Definitely. Like for me, the main requirements for gear is always that I want to use, that it's fun to use, and that it delivers a good performance. And I think it basically delivered on all those things. And this is also one of the reasons I use the 200 to 800 fairly frequently. Maybe not because it's the sharpest lens in the world, but because it's very easy to use and it's just a lens that you would have with you a lot. And I think it's similar for that Sony lens.
I can see that amazing image behind you. And when I saw that, I was blown away by it. But how did you take an image at f8? It doesn't look like you've got direct light on that bird. So how are you taking an action shot at f8?
Well, you are definitely stuck at quite high ISOs on all of these zoom lenses. So compared to the faster primes like a 2.8 or f4, it's definitely harder to shoot in like lower light conditions. But here in my backyard, I was still able to get just enough light for being able to take some flight shots. And my minimum shutter speed here is a 4,000th of a second. If I'm below that, it's just not sharp, or you get a lot of blur in the wings, for instance. So when the bird's stationary and then takes off, basically because it flies so quickly through your viewfinder, even if you're trying to pan with it, you need a really high shutter speed. Otherwise, you're just not able to freeze that action. And so on the A9 III, I had to use ISO 6400 most of the time, which is definitely not ideal, but doable. But obviously then you also need a good editing workflow where you remove the noise and get a good final result like I teach in my masterclasses, because that just helps you to then take a decent or average raw file and really transform it into a beautiful, stunning final image.
Yeah, it's probably a good point with these slow lenses because we are seeing higher ISO, and I think a lot of people are concerned about that, and fair enough. Nobody wants to see a lot of noise, but as you say, the processing now gives us that ability with denoise, etc., to slightly overcome those issues.
But enough about that Sony lens, because there was another lens released for Sony that actually kind of stole the show and all the hype from the 400 to 800, because Sigma released an f4 300 to 600mm zoom. What was your thoughts when you heard about that lens?
Well, at first I wasn't sure if it was true, to be honest, because I hadn't heard anything. You let me know. I thought, oh wow, that's crazy. Like I didn't even know it was coming. And then when I saw the price of 6,000 US, I thought, wow, I can see why it's generating so much interest, because I think in the US the Sony 600 f4 is 13,000. So this Sigma is half the price, and it's a zoom. It's kind of the lens we've always dreamt of, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, an f4 zoom 300 to 600mm range definitely sounds amazing on paper and would give you the ability to shoot wide open at f4 if you have to, but also zoom back if the birds come a little bit too close to you. I actually would have loved that lens in the dark forest when I was shooting the glossy black cockatoos recently, because 600 there was a little bit tight, but it was my only f4 lens basically that I could use. So I always tried to squeeze those cockatoos in. Yep. But if I had been able to just zoom back slightly, that would have definitely been super helpful in that situation. Seemingly having f4 and a relatively cheap price point is what make a lot of people forget about some drawbacks you might see in that lens.
Well, the weight is probably the thing that I've noticed straight away. And you've owned a lot of heavy lenses in the past. So how much did your first 600 weigh?
Almost 6 kilos or 5 something, I think. And that is very heavy. And I must say, the lighter your lenses, the more fun you have in the field. So the weight, while it's not a complete deal breaker if you use a tripod with a tripod head, it's definitely something to keep in mind, because lugging these big heavy lenses around, especially if you're not sitting in a hide or in a car, can definitely be a challenge and can actually take some of the fun out of being out in the field and photographing, because if your backpack suddenly weighs 15 or 20 kilos instead of maybe 5 or 6 kilos, you'll definitely notice that on even like a 2-kilometer hike.
Yeah, without a doubt. So I used the 400 2.8, the 800 5.6, the original 500, and the IQ is amazing. And I think that's probably what people want. They want that prime look, and that's why we get these big lenses. And the speed, of course. But the weight you just can't underestimate it. Like the amount of times I've got emails from people saying, even these lenses, they walk around with them and their arms just fatigue.
So I think we definitely don't want to be negative about this lens, because I think it's an amazing design. The price point is amazing. And it's, as you say, something we would definitely love to see from like Canon or Nikon as well.
100%.
But at the same time, there's also some limitations that will show more on some cameras and less on other cameras. But the main drawback for me when I look at this lens from a wildlife perspective and not a sports perspective is that you can't use teleconverters with that lens. And as we all know, 600mm is nice, but it's still not a lot, especially when you're photographing smaller birds.
Well, that's a very good question. I guess what springs to my mind is you own a 600 f4. And how often are you actually using a teleconverter? People may want to know, like, when do you use 600 and when are you using 840? And if you use 840, why? Why don't you just crop your 600?
In the past, I definitely used the teleconverter a lot more. Now I'd say it's almost 30-30-30. I know this doesn't add up to 100%. Let's just pretend it does. But basically, it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 what I use the lens bare and with both teleconverters. Because often when I photograph something really small, these birds are tiny. And to get them large in the frame, you definitely have to use the 1.4 extender. And sometimes, especially if you have enough light, you also want to use the 2x extender. And in my personal experience, using teleconverters and getting much more pixels onto my subject is always better than cropping. And so not being able to basically double my focal length would definitely be a challenge, especially when I photograph smaller rare birds.
I think 600 is probably fine for a lot of people, but it's just a restriction. One of the reasons we get these f4 lenses is so we can use teleconverters because they're quite sharp. And saying that, I guess the other restriction is you've talked about the A9 III already. Being restricted to 15 frames per second sort of denies you the ability to shoot at 120. From my perspective, I would struggle a little bit. It'd be almost like buying a Ferrari and only being able to go to 100 kilometers an hour or something. When we think about it, one camera or a couple of cameras that might overcome some of that would be, and I'll try and get the name right here, is it the A7R5, which is obviously Sony's big megapixel camera. I think that gives us, what's the crop on that?
I think 26 megapixels with a 1.5 crop. So basically you can cheat and have that teleconverter built into the camera because that's still a decent frame size afterwards. And most of Sony's mid or lower range cameras also don't shoot at more than 10 frames per second. So the 15 frames per second only really affects you on the A1 II and the A9 III and some of the older versions of those two cameras. So in that regard, you can definitely still get away with it, but I do think having a higher megapixel camera might actually make a lot of sense. Of course, cropping is not the best, especially heavily cropping, but at the same time, it might allow you to get really good use out of a lens like this, because the price point, at least in America, is great, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I agree. So 6,000 compared to 13,000, that's an enormous difference. But of interest, somebody commented on my channel. They said, have you looked at the Australian price of that Sigma lens? And I looked it up last night and they want 13,000 Australian dollars. And I'm assuming in other countries they may have the exact same problem. So whilst 6,000 in the US is a great price, just check your local, because here in Australia you can buy the Sony 600 f4 for 16,000 on sale. So it's only a few thousand more, and you'd probably be going, or maybe the Sony would be the better option. But you did mention something interesting. What could be another option people could consider instead of a 300 to 600 f4 that weighs 4 kilos?
Well, one lens of Sony's lineup that I really like is the 2.8 300. And so my line of thinking sort of started to creep in. Would that actually be a better alternative? If you are maxed out with both lenses at 600 millimeters anyways, with the 300, obviously I can use the teleconverters to get me to 5.6 600. And that was still quite sharp. And I was able to shoot little tiny Azure Kingfishers in flight with that combo on the A9 III, so it's definitely capable and sharp. And the big difference is that it costs the same, basically, but it only weighs 1.4 kilos.
Yeah.
So you'd have a tiny, super light lens that would definitely be a little bit more joyful in the field to use. Of course, you're giving up the f4 on the long end, you're losing one stop, and you can't zoom. Here in Australia, that lens actually costs only around 7,000, almost half the price of the Sigma. So definitely interesting.
And that's a beautiful lens, an absolute joy to use such a light lens. And obviously you get 120 frames per second, and you can use 420 f4.
Yep.
So you've got that option as well. Why is f4 so attractive? Like, as soon as it's f4, people seem to lose their minds that like, f4, give me an f4 lens. Well, you've got an f4 lens. What does it give you that slower lenses can't do?
I think, first of all, it does have that elusive feel to it, right? Normally a lens like this, as we said, costs $12,000, $13,000, over $20,000 here in Australia. So I can definitely see the allure there. And for me personally, I'm definitely not someone that likes to shoot wide open all the time. So whenever I can, I stop down 1 or 2 stops because it gives me more depth of field and a tiny bit more sharpness. Recently, when I was shooting the glossy black cockatoos in the deep dark rainforest, this is when you're happy to have f4 or you're wishing for like f2.8 because once it gets really dark and the going gets tough, these f4 lenses obviously have an advantage over any other lens. I tried the 100 to 500 in there because, as I said earlier, the 600 was a bit too long, but it wouldn't even focus on the R1. It was that dark. So my only chance to get any photos was actually using that f4 lens. And that's the main advantage of these lenses. You can use them in extreme low light and you still be able to get shots.
That scenario is where gear matters. Like we often say, gear doesn't matter and you can get really good shots with this lens, and you can. But there are those specific moments where this gear just absolutely shines. And you're saying that the 7.1, the 100 to 500 couldn't focus, because obviously when we're focusing with our lenses, people might not be aware, but we're using all the light to autofocus. So if you've got f4, you're using all that light, and when it's low, it makes such a big difference. So yeah, if you do shoot in low light all the time, I can see why people would want an f4 lens.
Or some people would say if you live in the UK, you would definitely need an f4 lens as well.
But gear's only half of it, and today's video has been pretty gear heavy, I must admit. But what keeps us coming back? Like, Jan, I think you probably take more photos than just about anyone, and you keep going out over and over and over again. So it can't just be the gear. What's going on?
Well, I think there's different aspects to it. Obviously, I just love teaching photography and showing others the experience on YouTube, or helping others to achieve what they want to achieve with their photography. That's definitely a big aspect for me now. But on a very basic level, just for myself, I think I just love collecting things. And so it was definitely a nice way for me to go out, photograph the different birds. And in the beginning, I was always after all these different species. I wanted to have one photo of like every species. Over time, this has really transitioned away for me now to more trying to create truly unique images of unique moments in the field. And I definitely still want to photograph all the parrots and cockatoos in Australia and maybe a few other ones around the world. But at the same time, my focus has gone more away from sort of documenting or collecting species really to creating, I guess, art ultimately. I don't actually even edit that many photos of the ones I take. I just really pick out the ones that I like the most. And then I spend sometimes a fair bit of time just making sure that those look the best they can be through good editing. And so that's definitely the main draw.
So it sounds like you get a lot of joy from the creative. Like, you obviously have a mental image when you're in the field. And I've seen this. You've got this magic ability to be able to see it in your mind of what you're trying to achieve. And you dedicate all this time to getting that and then executing it. So is that what gives you a lot of joy, is that end result of all that hard work, all that effort, all that time results in this vision? Is that what it's all about?
It does, and ideally you have also fun along the way, but depending where you are, it can be a bit tiresome sometimes. And I guess a few people that have been out with me will know that I can go back to the same spot over and over again if I really have to.
Doesn't sound like fun sometimes.
But in the end, that basically can give you the shot that you're after. If I know I can go back to a spot and get a better shot, or get like a shot that no one else has taken before, then I'm willing to go back and go back and go back until I get it. So it's definitely a balance. But yeah, I just love sort of creating something unique and then sharing it, or helping others, not necessarily to create what I create, but to create what they want to create. If I can help them to get on their way, whether it's be through in the field videos or the editing classes that I sell, it makes me happy to see that people are able to achieve the results that they want, or were able to achieve results that they never thought they could, just by giving them a few pointers. Even just having fun can be a big part of it. That's definitely more important for me now, like having a good time, hanging out with mates, rather than just always focus on just chasing something or achieving something.
No, I totally agree with you. And I'll be honest, I don't know if you've experienced this more than me, probably because you're out more, but this amazing thing when we meet subscribers or meet people in the field that follow us, and there's something very unique about it. I'll be honest that it's a little bit strange. Like, I'm just an old bloke that likes taking photos, and I'm not famous or anything like that. But the recognition people have, it's hard to explain. It's like when you meet someone you have recognition, and you, "G'day, how you going?" And so you're in the field and somebody walks up to you with this beaming smile, "Duade, how you going?" And you're going, "Do I know this person?" Or it's a complete stranger, but they obviously have seen me a lot, and so they know me. And people are just so friendly and they're so excited, and I try and take the time to have a chat to them, and the joy that comes through them obviously flows to me. And I get a lot of emails from young people saying that they're into photography and they're enjoying the channel. So I'm extremely grateful for the joy that not only I get from photography, but the fact that other people are getting it through us. And I think it's a really special privilege that we're in a position to help other people.
Definitely. And actually meeting people in person is something that I found very special. So if I ever go to some of these conferences or something, I always really like that aspect. So down the track in my mind, I have it at least, I would love to create something where a lot more photographers could meet, or we could all come together and meet. That's definitely something I would love to plan. Hopefully we can achieve that at some point. But the funny thing is always, right? Normally people get like recognized in like really popular places or like busy places, and we always get recognized when we're by ourselves in the forest, right?
As many people know, I have another job where I teach road safety to young people, and during COVID I had to do a lot of it via Zoom. And so I've zoomed into a class of like 15, 16-year-olds, and all of a sudden I hear, "It's Duade Paton! It's Duade Paton!" I'm going, "What's going on?" One of the students in the class recognized me, and they were wanting to ask me all these questions that I need to talk about road safety. It's just funny, and it's just part of YouTube, I guess. But if you see me in the field, come up and say g'day. I'm more than happy to have a chat, and I look forward to meeting anyone in the future.
For sure, it's always great to talk to people. And when my daughter started school, one of her classmates, their parents were like, I think my dad follows you on YouTube. So it's a small, funny world. There's a lot of people that are not able to travel for different reasons, obviously, and then they're often confined to a more restricted space around the house, for instance. And I guess that's true for you at the moment. So what do you try to do when you kind of have to go back to the same spot over and over?
Yeah, if you've watched my videos, you've probably seen that I go to Winton wetlands all the time, and that's where I meet a lot of people. And the question is, why do I keep going back to these same places? And you touched on it. Due to my family circumstances, I care for someone, so I'm not able to travel long distance. So I go back to the same place over and over again. And how do I make that interesting? Well, for me, there's a couple of things I'm always thinking about. I'm always looking for something unique, and I'm doing a lot of backlit on purpose. So I go and I go, what shapes, what can I look for? So I get there early with a purpose to try and capture interesting shapes. Sometimes taking a shorter focal length, if you have the ability. I went out with my 70 to 200, which is a focal length I never really use for birding at all, but I thought I'll just try that lens. And I got one of my favorite shots that I've taken with that lens. So sometimes, taking a zoom lens or restricting your focal length can make you have to look at things differently. So I think it's important that we get out of our comfort zone and just challenge ourselves. And maybe you've seen a shot online that you've gone, oh, I really like that shot. And you have to think, how did they do that? Can I do that in my local area? Can I do that with, in my backyard or whatever it might be? And for me, it's just been out there, just stuff happening, because you can't predict things, can you? Sometimes it just, magic happens.
And this is why I actually love doing all the gear reviews, because it forces me out into the field in my local area. Mm-hmm. If I just had my own gear, I probably wouldn't even go out. But so many photos I've gotten on these reviews because I've been forced to photograph something. And I really think we need to stop dismissing the obvious, because so many times, for instance, you're on a holiday.
Yes.
And you take amazing photos in someone else's backyard and they're like, geez, how did you do that? I live here and I've never gotten any photos like that. So we always tend to dismiss something that we could photograph in theory every day, but then we actually never get around to doing it. So I think going to certain places over and over can definitely give you different ideas of what to do. But when you're looking closely, you can also discover so many amazing things that you don't see at first glance. For me, here, video can really help a lot, because it first of all makes it more interesting. You capture something different, and you're also rewarded, because something that's a bad photo can often be a fantastic video. And so it makes yourself a lot more successful in the field, because instead of just capturing one or two photos, you might capture a few photos and then a few beautiful videos that you can also share.
Yeah, 100%. And even trying something different like landscapes, or you took a shot of a reptile recently, which I was surprised with, So sometimes photographing other things, I don't think people should be too critical on themselves on the end result, even if they don't get great shots to begin with. It's getting out there and learning and having fun whilst doing it. So I read a lot of comments and people say, I think Jan owns every single camera and lens ever released. Is that true?
Probably not, but I try my best.
Since you've got all this gear, I'm curious to know, what is the most fun thing you've had on Sony? What's the most fun thing you've had on Nikon? Like, what do you like about those brands, and what do you enjoy about them? And what struck you as, oh, I wish we had that on Canon?
The first one would definitely be the A9 III with the 120 frames per second. You can just capture actions or moments that you just simply can't even see with their bare eyes. And that is just so amazing. And also just having a bird taking off, knowing you will nail at least one or two poses in that sequence, just gives you a nice confidence, and also makes it more fun to me, because now you're suddenly rewarded every time you're trying something. Whereas in the past, maybe you tried this 100 times, you still not get one photo. And then the second piece of equipment that I love is the Nikon 600 PF, just because it's so small, light, it gets you to 600 millimeters, and you can still use it with the teleconverters as well. And this is where I just love that lightweight, that small body.
Yeah, totally agree. And if I'm being honest, some of my fondest memories are with my 7D and my 400 5.6 for the exact reasons you mentioned for your Nikon. I could pick that kit up. It was just fun. I had this short, light prime that was super sharp, and I had complete confidence in it, and it was just this joy.
You and I are obviously stuck in this YouTube world where everyone always talks about the latest and greatest gear, and we all use the latest mirrorless cameras. But I think a lot of our followers and subscribers, and a lot of people in general out there, don't actually use the latest and greatest gear or even want to talk about it. And I think we found some pretty interesting statistics on the gear that people actually use versus the gear we think they use.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We happen to come across, obviously, the Flickr site that a lot of people upload their photos to. They obviously record what cameras are used. And maybe I'll just set a challenge for you all. What do you think is the most popular camera that was uploaded to Flickr in 2024? Have a guess. Think about it. What would your guess be, Yard?
I definitely wouldn't have guessed what the most popular camera was. Now I know, obviously, but it shows how much the world has changed as well, kind of away from what we consider a camera to sort of what most people actually use as a camera now. So all of you had a little time to write a comment now with what you think it is. And I was definitely surprised because I think the top 8 or 9 cameras uploaded to Flickr in 2024 were actually different iPhone models, with the iPhone 13, I think Pro, being the number 1 of uploads. And there was only one, what I would call proper camera, in the top 10.
So the Canon R5 is the 10th most popular overall. But if we focus on cameras that we use for wildlife, what surprised me was the most was that there's a lot of DSLRs that people are still using. Is that surprising to you?
It definitely surprised me because I think there's such great benefits in using mirrorless cameras, the autofocus and image stabilization in particular. But at the same time, I can totally understand. If you just spend a lot of money on a good DSLR camera, you probably don't want to sell it instantly at a great loss. I mean, there's still good cameras. In particular, I think it was the Nikon D850 that was very high on the list. That's a fabulous camera, but I was definitely surprised, but not shocked by the amount of DSLR cameras because I've seen it in the field as well.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think when you think about lenses as well, it's quite a big cost to upgrade. And the Sigma 150 to 600 is such a good lens for wildlife that people are still sticking to their DSLRs. And the D850, as you mentioned, the D500, the D750, the 5D Mark IV. Obviously, we'll put a list on the screen here of the top 10. Let us know in the comments if you're still using one of these DSLRs. Does this surprise you? It'll be interesting to see what happens next year. But I think maybe we just need to be aware that, you know, there are a lot of people that are shooting with DSLRs, and maybe I need to create more content using those. But I still use my 40D and I still have my 1DX, which is up here. So yeah, it's just very interesting.
I don't know if you could get me to go back to use a DSLR. I'll try again.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could get me to go back to using a DSLR. I can't even say the name anymore. Going back to using a DSLR, because there's definitely some major drawbacks. And I feel like especially the higher frame rates as well now can just give us so much more. But it is definitely interesting to see that a lot of the cameras that we talk about all the time here on YouTube are very far down on the list. So there's definitely also a disconnect between YouTube and the real world, but I guess we all knew that already.
I reckon we need a challenge, make you shoot on a DSLR. I'm sure you'll still get some good shots. All right, so today's been another great chat. I always enjoy talking to you. I look forward to chatting to you again. I'd love to hear from people in the comments. You know, what are your thoughts on the Sony gear, the Sigma gear? What are you shooting with? What gives you the most fun in the field? Let's get a conversation going down there. And Jan, until the next time, happy birding, mate. Take care and have fun.
See you soon. And of course, also let us know what you actually love about photography, or is it just the gear? And we will see you next time very soon. Bye.
See ya.